to start pretty soon.
Hello, Aurelian. How are you?
Hey, where are you?
Still on the road, unfortunately. So
Okay,
sorry, I'm
that's
having to
fine.
call in.
Yeah, we need to help you change the dentist. That's something
Indeed.
I will look into and make some
Much
recommendations.
appreciated.
I will
That would
I
be
will take
great.
over, Scott, and do the introductions then. Is that okay? Okay.
Oh, that's completely fine. No, and thank you so much. And this is going to be a great event. I'm so excited.
And you can join us with this, with that. So it's 12 o'clock Eastern time. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for an unusual event and a beautiful event, an Ostrom Book Club, a discussion of the Bloomington School of Elinor and Vincent Ostrom through the lenses of two books that have been published in the last couple of years. My name is Aurelian Creyuțu, and I'm a professor in political science at the Indiana University, and I'm directing a small program called the Tocqueville program. With me, I have the pleasure of having three distinguished guests. Bobby Hertzberg, who is Distinguished Senior Fellow for the Hayek Program in Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and Senior Research Fellow at the Mercator Center at George Mason University, a longtime associate of the workshop. Good to have you with us, Bobby. Also with us is Professor Vlad Tarko, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Economy and Moral Science at the University of Arizona. Welcome, Vlad. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to with us. And Mike McGuinness, who is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Senior Research Fellow at the Ostrom Workshop. Mike is a longtime associate of the workshop and a collaborator of the Ostroms. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us. What we wanted to do is today, this is an event that we thought of organizing last April, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic closures, we had to postpone. What we want to do is to discuss the contributions of the so-called Bloomington School of Political Economy and Public Choice through the lenses of these two books, Ostrom Tensions, that was published in 2019, and it's a book that was edited by Peter Böttke, Dragos Pavlalić, and Bobby Hertzberg, with contributions from a variety of scholars, including Mike McGuinness and myself. The second book that we want to feature today is an intellectual biography of Elinor Ostrom, written by Vlad Tarko. So these two contributions add to the existing literature and interest in the Bloomington School. What we want to do through our interventions is to highlight two, or perhaps in the conversation that will ensue, two major things. First one is what makes the Bloomington School unique and distinguished from other schools in social sciences. So why should we talk more about the Bloomington School's unique profile? And the second question that I think will be present on the minds of all the participants and panelists is in what ways the contributions of the scholar associated with the Bloomington School, and in particular Lynn and Vincent Ostrom's works, can help us figure out new solutions to the problems of our age today. For example, how to deal with immigration, with healthcare, with climate change, with moderating the new media outlets, and so forth. So these are new challenges that perhaps the Ostroms did not engage with fully, but certainly we are interested in exploring today. The order in which we'll be speaking is as follows. Bobby Hertzberg will start first, followed by Vlad Tarko, and then I'll introduce a few topics from my own chapter on the Ostrom's eclecticism, and then Mike McGuinness will take over. I will have to excuse myself since I teach at 1 o'clock Eastern time, so I will be disappearing, and Mike will take over. Without further ado, thank you to all for joining us, and Bobby, you are first. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the Ostrom Workshop for this terrific invitation and opportunity to talk about the importance of the Ostroms and the scholarship that is taking place in this arena. I do have a few slides, so I'm going to go to those. I want to share my screen if I can do that. Where is it here? I've lost that. You know what? I think I can't because I'm not a host. That's why I'm having
David,
issues with this.
Are you on the line right now? Are you able to make her a co-host?
You should be able to do it, but I can go ahead and make.
I don't have it on the bottom of my.
Okay, well
maybe I do, but it's
Sorry
not
about
showing
that.
up here. It's really not that critical.
Usually, I mean, I have this set up so anybody can share, but I just made you co-host, so let's see if that helps.
Okay, let's see. Where are we here? I'm back at it. Is it in my share screen? It's not one of the options in my. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it. I don't want to take any more time. So let me just, it's not showing up there, and I may be in the wrong Zoom. I've got so many Zooms going on these days, who knows? And it's not that important. The pictures are just pictures of the book and the table of contents. So let me just talk a little bit about it for you and the idea behind it. As I'm sure many of you know, at George Mason University in the economics department and at the Precarious Center in particular, we are committed to an approach to economics that we like to refer to as mainline economics. And mainline economics is sort of built on this idea from Friedrich Hayek. And it's actually Pete Becky developed this logic of mainline economics, but it goes back to this quote from Friedrich Hayek that we actually have up on the wall at the Precarious Center in the student programs area. And Hayek says, in the study of society, exclusive concentration on a specialty has a peculiarly baneful effect. It will not merely prevent us from being attractive company or good citizens, but may impair our competence in our proper field. The physicist who is only a physicist can still be a first-class physicist and a most valuable member of society. But nobody can be a great economist who is only an economist. And I am even tempted to add that the economist who is only an economist is likely to become a nuisance, if not a positive danger. So Hayek's insight into the need for economists to think more broadly, I think it just speaks to all of the tradition of the Ostrom workshop, and especially the work of Elinor and Vincent Ostrom. We saw them model that type of behavior throughout their career and develop it. And so with this in mind, mainline economics really looks at the scholarship that Pete Becky suggests begins with Adam Smith, but that many in the modern tradition, starting with Hayek, James Buchanan, Ronald Coase, Douglas North, Vernon Smith, and Elinor Ostrom, all continue this tradition of this broader view of economics as incorporating the politics, the philosophy, institutional structure, and so many other components that help shape our economic thinking and our ability to pursue economic policy. So that's where our interest at Precarious comes in. And we use the Ostroms and the literature that they developed over their careers in so many of our graduate courses, but we've also now started to use them going way beyond that into work with other scholars, and that is this Ostrom's Tension book is part of that tradition, but also work with graduate students from graduate programs across disciplines and around the world. And we bring those students together and expose them to the Ostrom's literature, but also to the literature of the Virginia School of Public Choice and to the work of the Austrians and specifically F.A. Hayek. And so we see it as sort of our mission to try and spread these ideas. And Ostrom is a wonderful way of sort of showing how this builds over time to create a much richer understanding of it. And so that's the sort of grounding of it. The book itself is part of another series. We have these tension series: Ostrom's tension, Buchanan tensions, and Hayek tensions. So we currently have 3 books out. I know they anticipate doing additional books, but the logic behind the tensions was to suggest that that Ostrom and these other important scholars, while they are no longer with us, their scholarship continues to speak to us, continues to speak to new generations. And in order to do that, it needs to maintain its role of discovery and its role of unfinished things and new questions, and pushing it beyond the boundaries that it had already managed to get to by the time that we lost both of the Ostroms. So in this Ostrom's tension volume, the authors we collected, as Aurelian had suggested, we collected a number of essays from important scholars in the Ostrom tradition, and had them come together in a conference and interact with one another, and then produce the essays in the volume. And each of them had the charge of thinking about something that was left unfinished, or that still could be pursued more effectively, or that still raised concerns or questions, real challenges that they found in Ostrom's work, specifically Elinor Ostrom's work. But we all know from the workshop that you can't really understand one Ostrom without the other Ostrom, at least in part. And the volume has, as we're going to hear from Mike and Aurelian and Vlad, and they all have chapters in it. We also have chapter from Peter Levine, from Adrian Moreau, from Andreas Thiel and Eric Spadu, and Adam Martin. And so in the volume, there's some great work, and I hope you'll take it upon yourself to take a look at it. I just have one last thing, and that is, if in fact people are pursuing, we have graduate students out in the audience here, I hope you will go to asp.mercatus.org, which is the academic and student programs, and look at the different possibilities for exploring this work more fully, in addition to the work of Buchanan and Hayek and others. We have 4 different fellowship programs. They pay up to $10,000 for participation in them, which can always be very handy while you're in graduate school. We have the Adam Smith Fellows that is directed for PhDs and is a broad ranging across mainline economics. Bastiat Fellows for those that are considering government or law or more applied areas. And so there's a more of a policy and applied component to a lot of those meetings. The Don Lavoie Fellows, which is sort of Adam Smith-like, but it's all online, which was convenient this last year. And it covers 4 books that come out of this tradition, but that are current literature, and that's what we explore. And then the Oscar Morgenstern, which are for scholars and graduate students who are interested in more empirically oriented work, statistics and other econometrics, etc. And we find that they don't always have as much fun with the philosophy and some of the core theory arguments that we show how these works play out in that arena. So I hope you'll go there and explore this more fully. And I am looking forward to hearing from my colleagues on their contribution to this volume. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Just as a reminder, there were some fragments that were posted on the Ostrom workshop website for anyone interested in learning more about the content, I would have liked to share the screen as well, but I didn't want to interrupt Bobby. Vlad Tarko is next, discussing his intellectual biography of Elinor Ostrom. Vlad is also the author, as Bobby mentioned, of a special chapter in the Ostrom tensions entitled Institutional Complexity and the Public Choice Analysis of Feasible Policy Changes. Vlad?
Thank you for inviting me. So I've been looking for this event for almost a year now. Let me share the screen. Okay, so what I want to do is just give you a very short overview of what I'm doing in the Elinor Ostrom intellectual biography. So there's basically 5 chapters and an introduction and a conclusion. So I start into introduction, covering a bit of the biography of Elinor Ostrom, her difficulties in overcoming prejudice because she was a woman. So she had trouble trying to get, say, in a PhD program in economics. And also in this introduction, I'm looking at the way in which Elinor Ostrom and the Bloomington School more broadly see the role of the expert. So I think Vincent Ostrom's example of the role he played in drafting the Natural Resources Amendment in the Alaskan Constitution, that event played a very important role for Elinor Ostrom. Basically, gave an example of how the expert should behave with respect to public policy. And you may have seen this in Barbara Allen's documentary. Basically, Vincent Ostrom refused to just draft the amendment and thought, okay, we have to get more information from the actual stakeholders. So I think that kind of role model of how the expert should behave goes through Elinor Ostrom's work, throughout Elinor Ostrom's work. Okay, then basically the book goes in a somewhat, both in a conceptual order, but also follows Elinor Ostrom's life. So it starts with the Elinor Ostrom's and her students' research of police studies. So this, I think, is extremely relevant for today. So what they have done is basically looking at how exactly police studies in metropolitan areas are actually organized. And there were quite a bit of surprises there. Because people were just assuming a kind of simple hierarchical organization, or they were assuming that, say, small departments were overlapping their responsibilities, and that was not the case. So there was a lot of work just understanding how this complicated system of police services in a metropolitan area actually works. And then they looked at the performance of police based on different forms of organization of the police, namely if they were consolidated or not. So there were quite a bit of very important papers, I think, that I think you should all look at again, especially considering the focus right now on police and on, say, the way in which police behaves with respect to African Americans. So in the 70s, they addressed this. So in the chapter, I go from their work all the way to the present. And it's kind of a depressing read because they say there, they give a warning, basically, don't do this. But try to do this, and we basically did everything they said we shouldn't do. And I think a lot of people right now who study police, they're not aware of this work that existed. And I think Elinor Ostrom work with Roger Parks and Gordon Whitaker. It's one of the biggest studies of police in metropolitan areas. Also, all these papers are collected in Michael McGuinness' book, so they're relatively easy to find. So I strongly encourage you to go and see those. So I basically start with this kind of very important topic, which also is not so well known. And by the study of the police departments, they basically got a hint of how to look into a complex system. So the second chapter, I look in this concept of polycentricity, which of course is in the title of, or subtitle in Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize address. So what is polycentricity and why did they think it's so important? So the way in which I see it is that they are trying to understand emergent orders in general, right? So we have the example of the market as an emergent order, but the market works because there's a price, right? There's the price system that actually does the coordination, facilitates coordination. But what are we doing in systems that don't have prices? How does coordination occur in systems without prices? So that's kind of what polycentricity is trying to do. And Elinor Ostrom's idea is that the coordination happens because of the overarching rules that may exist. So then there's a whole reason to study those overarching rules and to see what happens. The next 3 chapters in the book go over the study of common pool resources, which are kind of an in-depth look at these kind of overarching rules. So in chapter 3, there's a bit of interesting biographical or intellectual biographical anecdote here that I think many people don't know, that Elinor Ostrom, while she was a student at UCLA, she took economics classes from Armand Alchin, right, who's a legendary economics teacher and also a very important economist. And one of the things that Alchin has done as an economist was, together with Demsetz, they created what's known as property rights economics, which basically brought to the modern day David Hume's concept of property, this whole idea of property as a bundle of rights. So Elinor Ostrom follows in the footsteps of Alchin and Demsetz and goes way beyond what Alchin and Demsetz have done. One reference here that I think is kind of showcases Elinor Ostrom's approach to property rights and to this idea of understanding property as a bundle of rights. There's an interesting paper with Adela Schlager. Property rights, regimes, and natural resources, a conceptual analysis. So you see in that paper how they go on this a bundle of rights theory of property, and they use it in practice for understanding common pool resources and common pool resource management. So then if we're looking at the rules, then there's a question, okay, what rules are good, what rules aren't good? And one of the things they've discovered by looking at many case studies was that it was basically impossible to have a panacea that would apply everywhere because the conditions would differ so much from case to case, right? So despite the fact that, say, from a game theoretical perspective, all tragedy of the commons have shared the same conceptual structure, right? The same mathematical structure. That doesn't mean that the same solution would apply everywhere, right? So for overfishing, you would have a very different solution than from, say, managing a forest, right? Despite the fact that from a game theoretical perspective is the same kind of tragedy of the commons. So then what kind of things can we say? So there's this idea of design principles that looks at the kind of a meta level rather than telling you how to manage the resource, they're telling you how to try to devise rules for managing the resource. So in this chapter, I'm going into this overview of the design principles, why they are in place, examples of these, how they apply to different case studies. And I also build on Michael Cox, Arnold Wen, and Sergio Villamayor Tomas' work, where they overview the design principles and they basically try to see, okay, is the list of design principles that Elinor Ostrom set up, is it sufficient? Are all those design principles necessary? What exactly is missing? So one interesting thing that I think it's quite important, and this has struck me while I was reading the Governing the Commons and then Understanding Institutional Diversity by Elinor Ostrom, she basically changes one of the design principles and changes it so much that it's basically, there are two different design principles. So Michael Cox and co-authors also notice this and highlight that no, these are two distinct principles. So one thing to bear in mind, right, so people say there are 8 design principles. There are actually 9 design principles in Elinor Ostrom's work. And for some reason, she dropped this local fit principle that she describes in Governing the Commons and replaced it with this fairness principle. But there's a case to be made that actually both of these are very important ideas. So this is something that many people don't notice, because everyone says there are 8 design principles. Another thing that I'm doing in this chapter is to look at the design principles through the lens of the type of rules they're addressing, right? So Elinor Ostrom describes a kind of a hierarchy of rules. There are operational rules that really describe how we're managing the resource. Then there are collective action rules that are about how we decide what operational rules to have. And then there are constitutional rules about how we decide what collective action, collective choice agreements to have. So one thing that Elinor Ostrom highlighted was she warned against using the design principles as a checklist. So why is that warning in place? It's because these design principles operate at different levels, right? Some of them are at the operational level, some are at the collective choice level, and some are at the constitutional level. So it's not just checking them out. It may be that, say, if you're missing one of them, that could be enough for explaining why the system doesn't work well. And in the last chapter, I go into this bigger question, and this kind of delves into Michael Cox's work with the social ecological systems, right? So one of the suspicion that people have is that the institutional analysis and development framework and these design principles, they only work for small communities. So what about if we want to understand, you know, the society as a whole, which obviously Elinor Ostrom did want to do that, right? What about very big questions like, say, global warming? Is the IAD framework sufficient? So I kind of look into this question, and it's still an open question. I think I'm a bit more optimistic about the usefulness of institutional analysis and development as a framework for understanding even big scale phenomena than, say, Michael Cox is. Also in this chapter, I introduced this idea of co-production, which kind of is very important throughout Elinor Ostrom's work, and in particular with the idea of rules, seeing people not subjected to rules, but being co-producers of the rules. So this is kind of throughout Elinor Ostrom's book. This is very important, say, from the police studies. That was one of the discoveries she made, that police departments that were responsive to citizens' needs because the organization was as such, that citizens were more involved with the setting up the priorities of the police, those police departments work better, and the same for common pool resources and so on. So this is kind of a short overview of what's in the book. So let me finish by mentioning, right, so one of what's exciting about writing about Elinor Ostrom and about the Bloomington School is that this is an ongoing research program, right? It's not like a long dead economist that were just kind of curious about their opinions. These are issues that are with us, and the answers that Elinor Ostrom gave are maybe not perfect, right? So the tensions book looks into that, like there are tensions in the work of Elinor Ostrom. How do we solve those tensions? What kind of ideas can we what can we do to go beyond what's already in Elinor Ostrom's work? So let me pitch another book that is gonna be published this year. It's a book that's co-edited by me and Jamie Lemke. It's called Elinor Ostrom in the Bloomington School, and it looks at connections between the Bloomington School and other schools of thought, right? So what's the place of Bloomington School within new institutional economics? What's the connection, say, between the way in which Elinor Ostrom understands rationality and behavioral economics? What's the connection with Austrian economics? The place within the bigger public choice school? How do we think of, say, the way Elinor Ostrom understood institutions and how, say, John Searle understands institutions and so on? So this is pretty much an ongoing research program, and it's quite extraordinary to look at what many people are doing and starting from this kind of foundation that Elinor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom have set up. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. It's a pleasure to acknowledge the important contribution that you make to a better understanding of the Bloomington School. I'd like to say a few things about my own chapter briefly, just to build upon what you said. What's the relevance of the thought of Lynn and Vincent, but also the collaborators for us today? And I think it's safe to say that we live in an eclectic world. And the title of my chapter is In Praise of Eclecticism. And I want to say from the outset that it is the fact that we live in a complex and eclectic world that prompted me to write this chapter on the Ostrom's eclecticism. It has several sections. I start by looking at how they responded to what's called the Tocqueville challenge. I discuss the eclecticism of the Ostrom's agenda, and I focus on a few topics that are central to the methodological eclecticism of the Ostroms, seeing like a citizen, the concept of polycentricity, and most importantly, against blueprint thinking, something that Vlad just mentioned earlier. I conclude the chapter with reflections on what the Ostroms teach us about making democracy work, and their relevance to a rather neglected area of their work, which is civic studies, which is something that I would like to see more developed in the schools of education, including at Bloomington. But I want to say a few things about the eclecticism, which is an interesting concept for understanding, I think, the Ostrom's agenda. I focus on three types of eclecticism in their work. First, the institutional eclecticism. And this is illustrated, of course, by the fact that they created a workshop in political theory at Indiana University in the early 1970s. In an interview with Frank Corton, Lynn wrote this: I was doing a bunch of research through the years that many people thought was very radical and people didn't like. As a person who does interdisciplinary work, I didn't fit anywhere. Hence the need for creating this interdisciplinary center in 1973-74 that was kind of between several stools at Indiana. They were not entirely at home in political science, they were not entirely at home in public policy, and they were not entirely at home in the business schools. So the workshop was created as a kind of a bridge, eclectic bridge, imperfect bridge between these units. And the need to create a cross-disciplinary science of politics, I think, was at the forefront of their work from day one. And they rejected, and this is something that I find inspiring in my own work today as well, they rejected factionalism and promoted collaborative work throughout their own career. It is no accident that the last work published by Elinor Ostrom in 2010 was entitled Working Together. And I think they went to great lengths to welcome collaborators from various departments, various disciplines, and certainly various countries. Also, to reflect on their institutional eclecticism, is important that they did not create a center. We all create centers today, mostly to become directors and co-directors and draw some money for research, but they created a workshop. In a workshop, people work together on an equal footing. There's no director or subordinate, and I think that this is very important for understanding their way of conceiving of political science. Secondly, it's their methodological eclecticism, which I think is reflected in their sources, in their concepts, and their interpretations. We all know, as both Bobby and Vlad pointed out, that at the heart of the Bloomington School, as developed by Lynn, Vincent, and their collaborators, lies the attempt to study the diversity of institutional forms in economic, political, and social life, and their implications for the study of governance, which is a key concept that kind of singularizes the approach of the Bloomington School. And in all of their works, we find an attempt to combine scientific rigor, very rigorous approaches, with policy relevance and more theoretical constructs that can be found mostly in the works of Vincent Ostrom. So we see here an intersection between several fields of inquiry, such as, and this is remarkable even by today's standards, political science, political theory, law, economics, public policy, public administration, political economy, anthropology, religious studies, and sociology of knowledge. To bring all of these subfields together under the umbrella of the workshop was something unique then, and it is even more unique today in an age where we boast of doing collaborative and cross-disciplinary work, but most of the time we are isolated in our departmental huts. And of course, the Ostrom and collaborators developed two models of analysis that we've heard about: the institutional analysis and development, IAD, and the social ecological system frameworks that required significant and sustained cross-disciplinary work and collaboration from different fields. Now, if we look at the sources that they used, I think it's even more eclectic and even more interesting. For example, in Vincent's work, we have passages used drawn from the works of Thomas Hobbes, Tocqueville, John R. Commons, James Buchanan, and Friedrich Hayek, but also they drew on economists such as Amartya Sen, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and Frank Knight, but also other works, the Federalist Papers, of course, and Democracy in America among them. And I think that this diversity of sources had enriched their approaches and represents something that is unique still today. Finally, I would like to say one thing about their political eclecticism, which is something that has somewhat been neglected. People have had hard time putting the Ostroms on a political map. Were they left wing? Were they right wing? Were they libertarian or not? And I think that at the heart of the philosophy of both Lynn and Vincent lies the attempt to go beyond the concepts of states and or markets. I remember that Lynn Ostrom noted in the introduction to a graduate syllabus on institutional theory that she taught for many decades at Indiana, that people may talk about, quote, the government doing X or Y, but there are individuals who hold positions in a variety of situations within the government. And this thinking, Lynn and Vincent thought, is deeply flawed, which explains why the Ostroms argued for shifting the focus of inquiry. And they resisted calls for bringing the state back in, the famous Theda Skocpol call for bringing the state back in. They thought that was a mistaken approach because it's an approach that simplifies a rather complex approach to a reality. So instead of the old concepts in political science, such as the government, the state, left, right, capitalism, socialism, the Ostroms preferred to use new ones, such as polycentricity, which, by the way, Vincent borrowed from the works of the Hungarian-British philosopher Michael Polanyi. Power with versus power over and constitutional artisanship. So what do we make about these concepts that do not fit easily in the classical categories: socialism, capitalism, left, right, government, or market? And I think that it's no surprise that their ideas were used by advocates on both the left and the right, and often used for defending contradictory opinions. And I think it's a testimony to the richness of their theory and approach that today we have left-wing approaches to the School. Derek Wall in England is doing terrific work applying Lean and Vincent's methods to understanding the diversity of institutional forms with a view to promoting more social justice. And we have more, let's say, right-wing. And I think that their call to institutional complexity and their fine attention that they pay to exploring that is a kind of a call to all of us today to go beyond the easy categories of left, right, capitalism, socialism, and state or market, and understand how people work together to live together in a free society. And I think this threefold type of eclecticism, methodological, institutional, and political, is something that differentiates the Bloomington School from other schools. It's easy to put Hayek on the map. It's easy to put Buchanan on the map. It's not easy to put Elinor Ostrom on the map. Where is she? So I'm going to invite you to speak about this if you are interested after that. Thank you. Mike, you are next.
Thanks, really. You caught me napping there for a quick transition. I want to thank the other members of this panel, especially Aurelian and Bobby for putting this together. And thank Vlad for giving me a plug for that 1999 edited volume I put together on police studies. It's polycentricity and local public economies for those of you who want to invest in it. And also want to thank you for plugging his new book, which is coming out shortly with Jamie, because I have a chapter in that one on new institutional economics, and I really like the opportunity to write that. And now I'd like to thank David Price for starting to share my slides, if he could, and get me up here with the first slide on my presentation. Thanks. Yeah. This is kind of a long title, as befits a very long paper, and I want to thank Bobby and her co-authors for letting me blow way past their maximum word limit by a considerable margin, I must say, because I really was putting together two papers rather, in this one paper. One was a focus on, or an examination of this rigor and relevance kind of balance that Aurelian mentioned in his talk. And I always found that as be a very interesting way of the understanding the Ostrom workshop. And it caused a lot of problems here at IU, because in our graduate program, we had specialties in theory and methods and in policy. And in both of those areas, the kind of work that Lynn and Vincent did, didn't really fit very well. They kind of fell between the cracks between those two. And I always found that kind of interesting. I was involved in both of those too, and it seemed perfectly reasonable to me, but not to some of the other folks. The second topic I want to focus more on today, which is how can they take, and how can we, who are still working and drawing ideas and inspiration from the Ostroms, how can we do a better job of identifying and furthering that balance, that rigor and relevance balance, and giving it a little more legitimacy in academia. And that's something that I'm very interested in pursuing. Next slide, please, David. Thanks. This is not the first time I've tried to wrap my hands around the workshop and what it all means. This slide's from, I think, 1995 originally. Patty put a little color in it for me in that, so I don't normally have color in my slides. This was a way to try to get an understanding of how all the pieces fit together. And I've underlined the ones here that are relevant to this particular paper to get about how this, they have an interest in practical policy problems, but they want to approach it from a perspective of theory and good research methods, and somehow combine rigor and policy relevance. And in the first half of this long paper, I go through different examples of research from the Ostrom research collection, the Bloomington School of Research in this area, and sort of show how they fit in. Some of them are more on rigor and some on policy relevance. And next slide might be a good way to sort of see this. Yeah, I've laid out the two sides of this here and underline where the Ostroms and their research tends to fall down. It's practical suggestions, but in a general context, systematic kind of, but it's not very easily replicable. Clearly communicating to the audience rather than to the policy participants themselves, unless we get too much into the IED jargon and things like that. Define concepts, but not in the way that the social science reviewers really want that certain level of operationalization. Recommends policy, but not quite the way that most policy analysts or advocates tend to do. As Aurelian just pointed out, there's almost never a fit between what makes sense from this perspective and a liberal or a conservative agenda in any way. It's always a nice combination. And use the right methods, but not necessarily in exactly the way they were designed to be used. And use research design, but again, not real perfect sort of research design, and engage with all the parties. It's an interesting sort of mix that I found very fascinating. And the work spans a lot of different combinations between them. But if we could move to the next slide, is what I really want to talk about in this talk. What are the pieces that could go into this mode of analysis and managing this kind of balance? Most of you, I hope, are familiar with the IED framework and the polycentric governance concepts and the basic approaches there, so I won't try to go through those. But the basic idea of an action situation is it's something like a game, a decision environment in which individuals with different interests work together to get some sort of result. But they jointly determine the outcomes of some policy question that they're both interested in. But I think it's important to see that these action situations are not just like pictures on a page. Too often, people trying to apply this come up with one action situation at one period in time, and they fit the variables into the boxes and all that. And it sort of stops there. It's meant to be a very dynamic process, and it's better to look at these as processes and to look at not as a game, as a static game, but a repeated game that gets played again and again and in different ways and connects to other games that are being played. And that in order to understand what's going on in an action situation, the ID framework is just a framework. So you need to bring some kind of animating principles into that action situation. What are the sources of the dynamic change that's in that particular situation? How do the aspects of the actor preferences and their options that they have interact with the environmental conditions that they're in, or environmental with the cultural conditions, the relationships, the political powers? How do all those pieces fit together is something that the analyst has to bring to the application, but the framework sort of helps you understand what you need to look at. And what you need to look at from this perspective is the other action situations that surrounding whatever it is you're studying, that the parts of the contextual conditions that are defining the situation that you're looking at or that the participants themselves are engaged in have been constructed somewhere, somehow, by some group in some way. And that's really where, if you want to try to change an outcome of a policy arrangement, you can go directly and try to force a change in that process, or you can kind of step back and say, how can we change the conditions here, make it easier to get a solution that we like better, or make it more difficult, make it for the current outcome to continue. And I think it's important to see that if you look at the games this way, the action situations this way, the participants are doing the same kinds of things. They're looking around to make changes in how they want to put the pieces together to fit it a little differently. They may not have the power to do that in all circumstances, but in the cases that Lynn looked at in Governing the Commons, she found a lot of capacity for local communities to make a lot more changes than most economists that would be looking at something think would have been possible. So back in 2011, I introduced this idea of adjacent action situations, where each action situation has these components: the contextual conditions, the working components in the action situation, the actors that are involved. And all those things were set up somewhere else in some other action situation that's either closely adjacent or pretty remotely connected to the situation. But then you can trace through that. And you can look at these contextual variables not as, you know, something listed in a box, but as a pointer to where was that value determined, and what was the nature of that action situation. If we wanted to change that situation, how do we make that sort of change? And I think that I was getting at the way that Lynn and Vincent looked at policy situations. I know when talking to Vincent about a policy situation back when he was still maybe not fully in his prime by the time I got here, but he could really analyze something and get you to look at a situation in a totally different way. And he really had a knack for that. And Lynn did that too in her analysis. And but how do you teach that to the next generation of students? How do you get them to understand that you need to have that kind of creativity? And can we come up with some kind of way of you know, doing that in a quasi-rigorous or systematic sort of manner that can be explained? And I think I'm really glad that Bobby and her other colleagues at Mercatus are really trying to push and integrate the Ostroms into their training programs, and putting them in the context of those related programs are really, really useful, because it really does require a lot of creative thinking to put all these pieces together. And in this paper, as I was writing this chapter, I came up with a vision, a way of looking at these action situations as not so much networks, but as something like a landscape, like an environmental landscape with lots of hills and valleys. And those are often used in analyses of socioeconomic conditions, ecological conditions, and other things. Like there are different energy potentials, and there's like you think of I always remember Stephen Hawking's diagrams of gravity wells and things like that. There are these hills, and a valley is sort of like a local equilibrium. And if you want to move to another equilibrium, and you have a ball in that valley, you have to push it up a hill, and it'll go into some other valley, and it'll maybe be higher or lower on that sort of condition, because gravity's pushing it. That's the animating drive, and that sort of thing. Well, how can we look at policy situations that way? And that, in effect, each of these action situations are kind of like in a little valley, and the hills are what sort of defining what's possible in that circumstance. And if you start to think then about this network of action situations as really being a landscape where there are opportunities to move in one direction or another, or several directions at once even, which is why the physical vision isn't exactly quite right, but you can change the conditions and end up in a totally different place. Well, how do you think about that? And obviously no one, this is something Vincent would have really emphasized, and Vlad touched on this, no one can see the whole landscape. Okay, no one can step back and be at 30,000 feet and look down at the whole landscape or all the policy opportunities. But we have a lot of sources of information that we can learn about what's possible. We can talk to the people who are directly involved. That's absolutely critical. We can look at the historical development of this. We can look at how similar institutions have been used in other situations and in other contexts. And there's just an awful lot that can be done. And to try to come up with a more creative way of fitting these pieces together. And I think that that's really the key to understanding how the Ostroms did their work, is that they really did think creatively, and they really did focus on understanding what are some of the options. And so, David, if you could get the next slide for me. This is where I try to come up with a strategic way, a self-conscious way of navigating through these policy landscapes. You start first by identifying the key actors and the focal action situations, and what are the other ones that are particularly important in their adjacency. This is the kind of advice I would give to graduate students when in the 673 seminar or other sort of working in other sort of areas in this. These next two steps are something that I think it's come to me a little bit more recently to understand it a little better. Actually, I don't have it in this way in the book chapter. This is the way I'm thinking about it now. You know, follow the money is a frequently used sort of phrase, and that's fine, but it's not all about the money. In these policy situations, it's important to follow the information. Who has information about what? Who's monitoring what? How often are they monitoring it? And then how do they sanction individuals in terms? So you got to have the information to do this sort of thing, and then follow the power of choice. In most of the cases that Lynn looked at in governing the commons, the community themselves had the capacity to change the conditions that were primarily important in improving their conditions. That's not always the case, and you may have to go to climb some hill. You may have to get somebody to help you or get some resources from some external donors. And a lot of people think that the Ostrom approach can't deal with the question of power. And I think that's just because we've never been explicit about doing exactly this. And that I think that this would be a way to get this to be more mainstreamed into some of the policy literature. And then finally, think strategically. You know, and at what points in this network is the places where we, or more importantly, the people themselves, could really make a difference in improving that condition that they started with. And here is where the strategic part, I think, is really useful, because to have a strategy, you have to have a goal. And the goal, at least whenever Vincent or Lynn started talking to folks about, in a community about what sort of research project they're interested in, what policy problems they have, the goal came from the people themselves. What is it that they want to improve in their relationships? And that's absolutely critical, because when push comes to shove, when all the policy analysts go away, those are the people that are going to have to keep that system running. And they're really ask us to talk about, you know, how any of this stuff could be relevant to today's politics. I can't think of anything more relevant to the question we have now of maintaining or reestablishing a democratic system of self-governance here in the United States, and focusing attention not on scoring points in partisan or ideological battles, but solving problems, solving realistic problems, and looking at what the options are, and going through that. David, I think I have another slide, but I don't need it because I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. I will have, unfortunately, to leave teaching, so Mike will take over the moderating role here. There'll be some questions that you can ask in the chat, and
Yes.
And anyone who wants to contribute is welcome. I'd like to thank everyone, and I will remove myself softly and gently. Thank you to all. And Mike, you are the master of the game.
Got it, Aurelian. Thanks. Again, a quick handoff. Yeah, as Aurelian said, if you have any questions, please put something in the chat. I already had you first on the list, Bobby. So I wanted to go to you to see how you think all this fits into what you guys are doing at George Mason and Mercatus. Bobby?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up to come back to sort of the book and the Ostrom contribution, and I'm so glad that we sort of ended on your chapter, Mike, because I think it demonstrates throughout that chapter how we think about these things really speaking to these other schools, and the importance of the Ostroms as being at that table when we're talking about whether it's sort of the process and knowledge and information channels of Austrian type processes, or it's the self-governance and logic that we get into. And one of the reasons I think we don't see people using this as much is it's so challenging. It takes so much work to be as careful. It takes a lot of pages. As you say, your chapter, Mike's chapter in the book was longer than other chapters, but part of the challenge of doing the kind of rich contextual work that the Ostroms did and recognizing the variety of self-governance and other ways that people could constitute themselves, that kind of work takes a lot of explanation and explication in terms of just making it clear to the reader. And I think that is sometimes a challenge in our world of doing publication through, referee journals particularly. And while some journals are kind about these matters, most will say, no, cut it by 2/3. And then it's hard to get that Ostrom richness into that without embedding it in a lot of other work that's been done at the workshop. But so I especially appreciated everyone's presentations here. The only thing I might say is there's the additional chapters in the volume really do speak even more directly to some of these issues of self-governance and some of the challenges posed by these complex systems of people trying to work their way through those many different adjacent action situations or other authorities that have a say in it, or those polycentric, contracting up and contracting down and contracting to the side. And if there was ever an issue, we see this playing out before our eyes, it is how we have responded to the crisis of COVID-19 and the different variety of approaches that states have taken and that the national government has taken, but additionally, the way in which individuals and communities have governed for themselves to cope with some really challenging problems. And that's one of the things we're working on right now is in this area and in the area of public health, just to suggest how again, these lessons from the Ostroms, these lessons from the workshop and the broader workshop family really help us deal with very relevant questions that face us today, and do it without just trying to randomly select things just to be doing it. To really understand how the kind of information and the kind of interaction that people have to pursue in order to design good policy and getting that from the ground up. And so I think we're going to have some great work that comes out of this from many of the students who've joined us over the last many years, but also from colleagues like Mike and Vlad and Aurelian and others that contribute. So I hope all of you, if you're working on interesting things, will share that with us so that we can make it available to this broader family that now is quite enamored with the Ostroms. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. While you were talking, I was realizing how much I appreciated your guys' flexibility and the work you're doing to publish things. Like I mentioned, I'm doing a chapter in one of the other books on the New Institute of Economics connection. And it reminds me of how you'll remember all those books that were published by ICS Press around the workshop back in the day. And Vincent in particular experienced a lot of trouble getting his work published, because he would tend to go on and he would often get, as you well know, reviews back, and he'd say, those are fine reviews, but I'm not going to do that. And Barbara Allen was able to put together 2 volumes of very nice papers that he just never got around to publishing. And part of it was because of the difficulty of sort of shoehorning this approach into the standard categories of journals, or even university presses or prestigious university presses. So it's important to have this sort of other options to publish things, and I really appreciate that Precarious is providing, and not just for those of us who are retired and don't really have to worry about where stuff's coming out, but for you're going to be helping a lot of these junior scholars really get a head start on their publications. I will see that Travis has taken the initiative of doing the using the hand raising approach, and so I would encourage those of you trying to get my attention to go for it. And Travis, you still up there in Bloomington these days?
I'm next door to you, Mike. Well,
no, you're not. I'm in Florida.
Oh, yes.
Travis, take it away.
He's
up here.
pursuing the free strategy of Florida.
So, Mike, please correct me if my preface to this is not correct. But I recall that Vincent was unhappy with parts of how the libertarian movement went. He was an early adopter. And I'm curious to hear the three of you talk about, by the way, hi, Vlad. I'm curious to hear the three of you, or any or all of you, talk about how Lynn confronted political movements or developments that she was unhappy with and perhaps didn't expect, and how she might have dealt with that, either philosophically, as I think all your books, your books and paper discuss, or in other ways. Thanks much. I'm going to turn myself off again.
Well, I remember many conversations. This is just in conversation with Lynn. In part, when I came to the workshop, it was early in the 80s, and I didn't understand Vincent at all. I understood Lynn when I came, but no, I mean, it was a learning experience. And by the end, felt like, wow, it was so important to understand Vincent, but it was not he did not make it easy. And Lynn, in talking, so I would talk to Lynn about where Vincent was coming from and the politics of the time. And it was so interesting because she said the theory and the results don't have politics. People can feel bad or feel good about them. They are. And so it was the discovery of options, the discovery of choice, letting people decide for themselves what they believe those good options to be. And whether you were coming from the left or coming from the right or coming from a libertarian perspective, whatever it was, you were likely to see those outcomes through a different lens. But that didn't change that was what you would expect out of this institutional form. And I think that's what drove them back to constantly wanting self-governance, because it was that humility of, we can't possibly decide this for others. I don't want them to decide it for me. And you could see that with Lynn. She didn't want Vincent deciding for her. And in the same way, that but she appreciated his work, and I think it really is testimony in what Aurelian was saying about sort of above politics in that regard. And I think she thought that followed from the institutional analysis as opposed to it should drive it. And what's worrisome for me today is we decide where we're going to start the end point is where we begin building backwards. And I think that's troubling. But, maybe it's just because I'm old that I think it's troubling. I don't know.
Aurelian, I didn't mean to exclude you. Sorry.
Okay.
I think he's actually off the
He's
class.
out of here.
So we can speak of him in any way we wish at this point.
Vlad, I'm going to give you a chance in a little bit if you want to respond too on this, but I want to make a few comments. But Bobby was right on the mark there about Vincent being kind of hard to understand initially, and he at the time did take some pretty strong stance. He was very opposed to busing, for example, and that comes out in his public administration book back in the 60s and 70s. And it wasn't because he had anything against African-American communities or minority communities. It was an imposition on the local communities that should have been able to figure out a different way of integrating their communities. But he also wasn't sort of pragmatic enough in a political sense to realize that wasn't possible in these communities, that there wasn't the level of goodwill to do that. and that you kind of had to have the national government kind of hold the local government, local people speak to the fire to do that. And he just wasn't willing to accept that. And he had, Bob, you will remember, he had a few issues with various women's rights issues and the same sort of approach. So he definitely had libertarian sort of tendencies in that sense, but boy, he would never make that sort of the reason why he decided one way or another was because it was a libertarian position. It would be how he analyzed sort of the situation. On Lynn, I've got this great story about, not long after she got the Nobel Prize, and oh man, it was nutso around the workshop those days. And Lynn was on interviews all the time. And late one morning, I remember coming back down to the lobby of the workshop after being up in her office. She just had two like half-hour or hour phone calls with journalists. And she just had this very strange look on her face. She said, I just had this long interview with someone who was going on about and criticizing our work for not taking into account market problems, not market situations. Why aren't you answering all these problems in terms of markets? Why aren't you emphasizing, we want to know about price and economics, for God's sake? Why aren't you talking more about economics? And then she hung up on that one, and then right in the next interview, why aren't you talking more about government roles in the state and bringing all the liberal sort of approaches and state sort of dominated approaches? And she just kind of came down and said, they just don't understand it. It's not a one or the other kind of thing. You've got to mix these kinds of things together. Dan Cole has a nice article where he talks about the difficulty of categorizing their work in politically. And I think Bill Bloomquist did something with, forgetting his co-author on this, a recent paper on how you just can't sort of fit these pieces together. But it just never kind of fits in to all of this. Vlad, do you have anything you want to say on this? Because you looked at Lynn's thought processes pretty carefully, and that's got a lot of Vincent in it.
Yeah, I think the closest kind of political movement that they come to is ordoliberalism in Europe.
Yes.
So yeah, that doesn't really have representation in United States. So that's kind of part of the reason why it doesn't fit the regular discussions, right? So at some level, they seem, even Vincent Ostrom seems to be quite left-wing, but it's a left-wing position that appreciates decentralization a lot more than the left in United States. And of course, as Mike mentioned, decentralization has these connotations in United States with respect to race relations. So that's kind of part of the problem. Elinor Ostrom has this kind of nice thing in understanding institutional diversity, where she says, well, the part of the role of the higher levels of government is to prevent local tyrannies. So it's kind of, yeah, we're appreciating decentralization for some reasons, but that doesn't mean they should have free hand to do anything they want. I think this discussion kind of fits with Gustavo's question in the chat about power. How does power fit into Ostrom's framework? So a lot of the framework of polycentricity and of institutional analysis and development looks at the potential for abuse. So how do we set up institutions such as basically any kind of institution will set up some positions that will have more responsibilities and kind of more power over other people. So then how do we make sure that those people who are in those positions don't abuse that power, right? So Vincent Ostrom has this whole thing, the Faustian bargain, right? It's like, okay, we want to have a large scale cooperation, but in order to do that, we have to create this kind of positions that would enable this large scale cooperation. But once we do that, we're going to enable power over us, how do we then keep that power in check? So I think this concern with power is actually very deeply embedded in the whole Ostrom process, right? So part of, say, when we're looking at institutional economics, it's often that they're looking at what the rules are and not so much on how they're enforced and monitored, while the Ostroms are all about, well, okay, you have these rules on paper, are they enforced? There's like these stories with Elinor Ostrom going to some country and they're showing her the maps with these are the borders and so, and she goes on the ground. It's like no one knows that the borders exist. It's like, okay, the rules are clearly not monitored and enforced. So that is essential to actually understand what the rules are.
Yeah, Vlad, I think you hit it well, and Vincent really had this strong emphasis on the sort of the intrinsic dilemma in governance, and that you need some coercive capacity in order to resolve some collective action problems. So you need some sort of power and somebody to make rules and enforce them and enforce punishments. But at the same time, you need to make sure that person doesn't abuse the authority. And it's sort of the classic liberal problem of how do you restrain rulers. And it's why Vincent was so enamored of the Federalist Papers and the way they, the founding fathers at that time, were able to fit together a set of institutional constraints that would act on all of these different actors, that there would be powers interacting, different powers would be balancing each other. And because there's always the case that this is going to be the potential of being abused, and that you needed to have some other opportunities to deal with this. And that's why he was so interested in polycentricity as a system of governance, because it was to give citizens other options, that there would never be a situation where there was one authority over everything to do with water or everything to do with electricity, because then you're at the mercy of that particular group, that particular actor. And polycentricity sort of takes the logic of market processes into the governance realm in a way that at one point did become an important part of the discussion in the US about decentralization and privatization and those kinds of issues. But for Vincent, it was more a fundamental kind of problem and not really a partisan sort of issue. Jamie, you've had your hand up for a while. Why don't you join in?
Well, you set me up really well, because I was going to ask, and my understanding of the Ostromian approach to polycentricity is exactly what you pointed out. Vincent's love for the Federalist Papers and this idea that you have power dispersed through a multiplicity of political actors. And so that's a different understanding than the one that you initially proposed, Vlad, which is this idea of dealing with emergent orders. Do you, and so this is kind of a question for the entire table, but Vlad, if you want to answer, is there an interaction between this idea of emergent order and like the Federalist kind of polycentricity that I understood to be an Ostromian concept as well as a Federalist concept?
Yeah, so federalism is one example of a polycentric system, and the work that Vincent Ostrom is doing on polycentricity, on federalism, builds on the Thibault model, right? There's the famous paper with Thibault and Warren that they are basically taking the Thibault model, which is a kind of a perfect competition model, and they're asking, okay, what if there's not perfect competition among the jurisdictions? So in the Thibault model, it's very much an analogy to a market, but then that analogy doesn't really work in practice. So then we want to understand it in a more realistic fashion. But still, the federalist system, it's still an emergent order, because these you have, say, one jurisdiction takes some decisions, but that will have an impact on everyone else. right? People will move, capital will move. You will say one jurisdiction zeroes in on some rules that work better than others, then they get imitated. So in a sense, the order that emerges in the entire federal system is not planned or predictable, right? Is the result of all these different jurisdictions independently choosing various things, and then some kind of emergent order appears. But because there's no price there, right? You could kind of try to have some prices in there, like say tax rates, stuff like that, but that doesn't cover the whole complexity of federalism. Because there's no price system there, the question is, okay, will this emergent order be efficient in any way, right? Because we have a way to understand efficiency if you have a price system, but if you don't, then why isn't this whatever emerges just some random order that is in no way efficient or has desirable qualities, right? So that's the big question. How do we make sure that this kind of whatever emerges in this kind of complex systems without prices has desirable properties?
And what you're talking about, that thing that's desirable, it's value, right? And that's something that I grapple with because I actually come to Ostromian thought as a musician and musicologist. So I'm actually dealing with this idea of value, but the kind of value that you can't quantify with the price system. And that's something I think this is a problem that has kind of been poking at me since I was an undergrad. That was many years ago now. And I find that sometimes people will say artists aren't succeeding in the market just because it's not what the market wants. Like they can't make enough money because it's not what the market wants. Well, but you can't necessarily quantify artistic value with a price. Like you can't quantify political value with a price. There are other types of value in this world. And so what you're aiming at, I think, is the same problem that I'm interested in, which is how do we talk about value that you can't put a price label on, because it does exist in this world, even if we don't have all the terms for it.
But I think, honestly, I think that's why the Ostroms were so strong on the concept of self-governance, because of the ability to have these very subjective preferences. So there is no single way we want to deal with this policy that everyone agrees with. If in fact you have this federalist form, the logic is there's more possibility for people to be satisfied on these things that are very hard to quantify. If you could quantify them, you could maybe redistribute across in a way that would solve it, but you can't. And so we let people organize themselves within communities that reflect some of those additional values that are hard to just do with taxes. But then you move to this constitutional form. They believed in constitutions. They believed in having a knowledge about the rules and having the rules specified in some form. And I think that's where we get the tension between the emergent order and constitutional choice. And the Ostroms, I think, straddled that very well, so that these were emergent in the sense they were consistent, but at some point we sit down for the predictability of a constitutional choice process with mechanisms for how we will change that constitution that then permit us to have changing values as our population changes. Because as the social changes, so too do the social preferences. And so that was, I think, the more interesting tension is who has access to changing the rules and how frequently do you do that and still have stability and so on in this federalist form. But
yeah, it's important to bear in mind that there are many possible federalist systems, right? So not all federalist systems work equally well. Right? And Vincent Ostrom is looking at American federalism. That's not just a random label.
Yeah, let me weigh in on here a little bit, because emergence has sort of been one of my pet peeves in that it gets a little too much emphasis. from some of the people who are using those Ostrom approach, because they also emphasize the importance of public entrepreneurs. And public entrepreneurs are making plans and are making changes and writing constitutions. Clearly, the American constitutional order did not just emerge, it was designed. But the design process was to set up the conditions that would support an emergent process of the power balance and balance of power operating. So in effect, emergence is an outcome or a process, emergence is a process that requires the right conditions for it to prosper. And from Vincent, I think's point of view, and from Lynn's point of view especially, a critical goal of top political leaders, political authorities, is to set up the conditions to make it easier for groups to govern themselves. Or as Lynn even said in a Nobel Prize, to make people as good as they can be, to make us bring out the better angels of ourselves, to use the Lincoln sort of thing. So it's not a either or kind of thing, emergence or top down. They're the same. I mean, in Vincent, I think would go even, he would go this far too. He would say markets don't just emerge. They're in the context of laws for property and for exchange and for contracts. And you can't just have a market you can have a market that totally emerges without any of that, but it's not going to be a very efficient one, because you're going to be constantly challenging the basis of who owns property, who owns what. So that it's like Lynn used to often say, you have this Indian or South Asian image of an elephant holding the world on its back or something, and then the elephant standing on the back of a turtle, and then you say, well, what's after that? It's turtles all the way down. After that, there's no ultimate foundation in this. It's all just kind of emerging from that. I think I mangled that image, but we had time for, I think, one more quote. Travis, is that another hand up or the same hand up?
That's the same hand up, Mike. Thanks.
Okay, then I think we're close enough to 1:30 that I'm going to draw this to a wrap. I want to thank those of you I still see on my screen for hanging to the bitter end here. It's been a really good discussion. Thanks, Scott, for setting up the process for this, and thanks for all our participants, including Aurelian, and let's give us all ourselves a good hand. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Guys. That was just brilliant. And just as a reminder, we'll be featuring Jamie Carini next week in the research series. So hope to see you there. That was absolutely fantastic. Thanks so much again, guys. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye, guys.
Be in touch.